Hey Ibrahim, great to see
Hello.
you. And
Hello.
amazing. And that looks like the structure behind you, the
Yes.
silo. So can you tell us a little bit about it? Where are you? What's its significance? And why did you get it?
Thank you very much, Susan. And thank you to the entire team of White Cube for organizing this and to all the audience and everyone else. Yeah, so I've been asking myself a lot of questions during the lockdown period. Before the lockdown started, the government in Ghana had proposed selling of this site, this building in Tamale. It used to be the Food Distribution Corporation. It was a company created in the 1960s, post-independent by Kwame Nkrumah. The idea was to create these bulk food storage companies, and this was one of them. So there are these massive silos that were built by Eastern European architects at the time. So in a bit we'll go down there, but they were basically created around the time when the African Union was being created. Of course, in the mid 20th century, Ghana was the largest producer of cocoa in the world. So the revenue that was generated from cocoa was what was used in building like the newly independent country, like the motorways, governmental buildings and all that. And the silo was supposed to be one space that was supposed to help us to elevate like that, the poverty at the time, and also just to fulfill the economic emancipation program of Kwame Nkrumah. Because at the time when the West was striving in a very capitalist sense, like countries which were in the Eastern Bloc and also countries which were part of the non-aligned movement were trying to find ways in which they could expand the various degrees of freedom within human existence, and also trying to solve a lot of economic problems that were there at the time. So when they started building it, there were several of them across the country, but they were abandoned in 1966 when Kwame Nkrumah was overthrown. So after the overthrow, most of these buildings were never continued again, like most post-independent structures which were abandoned. So in my work, since I was a student at the Kwame Nkrumah University at the arts department, one of our professors, Dr. Karikacha, has always encouraged us to somehow go to town, go into the city, the rural areas, and take inspiration from things that already exist. There could be objects, architecture, and all that. And I originally started working with the jute sacks because I thought that the jute sacks had some kind of a relationship with these buildings, because the jute sacks are used in transporting cocoa originally. And these are the buildings that was meant to be finished to contain the cocoa, which would then now be used as a position to trade with the West, but which never happened. So now when cocoa is produced, it's mostly just sold. So the farmers don't really get the right proceeds that they have. So I'm very much interested in the contradictions that are posed between the objects, between different objects, and knowing that, also, of course, when I started my practice, I used to go around buying these jute sacks, trading them, getting the old ones, stitching them together with the collaborators, and then covering structures or buildings like this around the country, both which were active and abandoned. So now, being able to use the same capital that is coming out of the work in order to acquire the building, it's actually quite interesting, because it's almost as if I have used the ghosts or the residues of the work or the failures itself somehow to go back to revive. It's like the return of the living dead.
It's a kind of circular economy, isn't it, really?
Yes,
It's kind of,
yes,
yeah,
yes.
which is amazing. And
Yes.
this particular silo, I mean, so it was built when exactly?
This one was built in the early 60s, and it's the last time it was ever touched or occupied was in 1966.
Wow, so it's been empty for more than 50 years.
Yes, like
Incredible.
54 years. So the first time when I acquired it, that was the first time in 54 years that anyone in the city had actually seen the under of the building. Because when Kwame Nkrumah was overthrown, there was a propaganda that was spread around that he was building these silos around the country as political detention centers for his opponents. So, and because they were also very deep and there was a lot of water gathering in them, so no one ever even bothered to even drain the water to find out what was in it. So for instance, in Tamale, they called it the Nkrumah Voli, and Voli literally in our language means the hole or like a void or something. But the reason why they called it the Voli was because they believed that Kwame Nkrumah built it as a tunnel, and there were so many stories around it that Nkrumah could go underneath, could go into the silo and appear from Accra or appear in the Eastern Bloc or things like that. And I think it's quite interesting because it's almost like then when you think about the myth surrounding the building in terms of the idea of the void, it almost acts as if it can be some kind of a teleportation device or like a wormhole or something. And that's what really like drew my attention to the space.
Yeah, I mean, is it like the conspiracy theories have obviously abounded, and
Yes.
And so sort of what's your sort of plan with this building? I mean, are you going to cover it? Are you going to activate it? What exactly are you going to do with it?
Well, last week, Friday, for the first time in 54 years, we reoccupied the building. Of course, throughout from March till date, since I was acquiring it, we were cleaning it out, and then there was a lot of mud and dirt and water which was trapped in it. So we had to pump the water out and then excavate the building, literally, which took about 3 months to do. And then last Friday, I had a public lecture here to have a conversation with the public and the people in the city, just to also to further demystify the building and somehow to reorient them with regards to what they think they know about the space and its relationship with our history and the history of the rest of the world. Because when you start thinking about, we have even like a graveyard in Tamale, which they have a lot of Russians and Eastern Europeans, Germans, and other Europeans buried in, but most people don't even know about it. Or we have these bungalows here called the Russian bungalows, which were built by the Russians like pre-independence. So when you're in taking like a piece of building and trying to connect it to other buildings or other aesthetical forms around the world, people almost think that it's far-fetched. But when you begin to somehow create the relationship between these things, I guess it goes a very long way to make a difference. So their plan is basically to convert it into like some kind of a greenhouse and to allow what like the void, or because there were a lot of living things in the building over the last 54 years, like bats, fishes, snakes, all kinds of snails, all kinds of things inhabiting the building. And I thought it was quite beautiful because now the building moves from the site of the human or the anthropomorphic to other life forms. So it means that we can suddenly begin to experience the building from, let's say, the way these bats will experience it. So the plan is eventually to expand the building in the underground, so we could possibly navigate it in a very different way, and then also find, extend, let's say, urban agricultural practices and other things, because it's right in the center of the city.
Do you think we can then have a quick tour of this building? And I mean, what's interesting, even looking at it from here, is that it doesn't really give you an idea of how deep it goes, and so that's what's interesting when you say about you having to kind of excavate. Do you actually know the depth of it yet?
Well, it's from the ground to the first floor. It's about 40 feet, so that's quite deep. It's about 15 meters. Yeah.
So this is wonderful. So what are we seeing here?
Yeah. So this is just the ground floor of the space, and there are many of these buildings around the country. But when you see them in isolation, it's very difficult to somehow connect them. But because I was doing in the Exchange, the book that we published in 2015, I was covering some of these buildings, and I made a note in it, one of the sections titled Sites of Potential, because I thought they were interesting and they could somehow play a very important role in the future with regards to the architectural forms I was somehow investigating. Yeah, so it's quite beautiful in terms of how the columns are arranged, and even like structurally, we don't really get to see buildings like this that are being built, and you can find these same types of buildings in Poland, Ukraine, Russia, in the UK, in America, and other places at the time when brutalism was very, very high.
Definitely, yeah. And how do you think, I mean, the use of this, can you say a little bit about your other cultural spaces? So how is this in conjunction with SCCA and Red Clay? How they distinguish between, how do you distinguish between them?
Yeah.
Is there a different
Yes.
program or intention?
Yes, there is, because this building, I almost find it as some kind of a connection between Red Clay and SCCA, because the interesting thing about this building is that I was doing my research in these buildings before I started building even Red Clay. So the idea was to use the failures of this building and the architectural form as the starting point to even construct those two institutions. So this is how the basement looks like. So there's
Wow,
currently a lot
it's
of water.
Yes.
Yeah, because it's yeah, because it's been raining a lot these days, and we haven't sealed off most part of the building yet. So originally, there is a black line somewhere. Yeah, so this is where the water level was originally.
Wow.
Yeah, so you can see we had to do a lot of work in it to go down. So we had to build this bridge across it originally when we needed to excavate the building. So there is another, below this water, there is another floor down, going down. But you also have these spaces. Sorry, this is a bit dramatic.
Don't fall in.
I won't fall in. The water is not that deep. Yeah, but it's just,
it looks
yeah,
incredible.
so, yeah, pretty much we've been able to maybe, yeah, we've been able to clear out everything. Before, you couldn't even enter the building because the water was all the way up to where the black lines were.
Wow.
Yeah, so we had to clear everything out. And I think that it's particularly important in what it does in connecting us to the issues of contemporary art, because in using the subject matter or the space that I was trying to represent within my work, or the conversation in my work, I thought this could somehow be the bridge between it, because I've always been interested in the issue of failure. So SCCA, when it was created, the idea was to dedicate it as a space for retrospectives and somehow going back to reviving a lot of the work that was being done by the older generation. And Red Clay later, the idea was to expand the institution. So you see, there are a lot of these bats that are occupying the building at the moment. So I thought that was also really interesting.
That it certainly is. Wow, that's yeah, and I think it's interesting. I think when you're saying also about the fact that these are the first institutions of their kind in in that region, and so again, I mean, I think you were saying when we spoke the other day about also using this site for perhaps a presentation of archaeological finds. Is that correct?
Exactly. And I think it works also well because of the architecture and how it's presented. Because that was one of the first instincts that I had. Also because of how maybe parts of the concrete have aged over time. But we've done a lot of research. We've worked with structural engineers to test it, and everything is fine in the building. It's just some small repairs that need to be done within it. So I thought that was quite interesting to be able to connect the archaeological aspect of our history, because we have a lot of archaeological materials. Currently, I'm in conversation with the National Museum in Accra to see how we can borrow or loan some of the objects within their collection, which have never been seen by people outside the context of the capital, to have some of these exhibitions in Tamale. And of course, we'll do that in the dry season when it's not raining and we've sealed all parts of the building. So when we use this space and we present these archaeological materials in this building, I think that there's going to be a lot more dialogue or conversation to be had, particularly when we crisscross some of these histories. And also given that we also had some of the early objects in our museum, which were gifted to us by the Soviet Union. So it's also quite interesting to think about bringing these histories back together again, in terms of buildings that were built within the era by these same people, and also objects that were given to us as a symbol of friendship or like brotherhood.
So, and it's very interesting, thinking about these archaeological finds, because certainly from the period of sort of British colonial rule, and that a lot of these things would have actually been taken out of the country. And for you, it's very important, obviously, that it is And you know, why is it so important for you to work locally?
Oh, well, I think for me, the idea of the gift, using art, seeing art as some kind of a gift, is very important because at the end of the day, as an artist, I always say that I feel quite lucky because I had the chance to experience the art world at a very early age. And also the background and training that I had from the university in Kumasi. Our professors always stressed on the need to be able to allow whatever work that we do to reflect on the society or the community that we find ourselves in. Because no matter how hard you try, like mostly it just happens that when all the significant work that we do, they just end up in Western institutions. Like for instance, taking a non-rentable in cancer, for instance, which is in Miami, and another museum in America, or taking other important works. But then if you look at it in the context of the continent, we don't really have a lot of institutions that are able to somehow contain artist practices in this manner. So that's why I thought that it was important to somehow create these spaces, one, and also revive other spaces, because the objects I collect to produce my work, like the shoemaker boxes, non-rentable, they were from all these old post-independent factories which were being demolished, and I used part of those in the construction of the artwork. So now buying the silo is almost like the non-rentable in cancer, but in the silo you cannot is the silo, and it will remain here. And at least for once, something which was built as a public institution, which was never really realized, we can use the contradiction of private funding to acquire it and bring it back in. A lot of these contradictions in my work, and trying to see how the idea of the local can benefit from it and somehow change the perception. Experiences that people would have never had, they will have it now because we have these institutions.
And so you held your first event, the kind of unveiling for local people, as you say, last week. And what was the kind of response? Were they puzzled, or were they, you know, I mean, what did they want to know what you were doing? I mean, how was the feedback?
Well, everyone thought I was crazy because no, no one, when everyone hears about the place in Nkrumah Voli, because there are so many stories around it, everyone always thinks, oh, well, isn't it that place that Kwame Nkrumah built as some kind of a passageway to Accra, blah, blah. But when they came, and of course, obviously, they saw that it wasn't what it is, and also through the lecture, they realized that suddenly it could be a place that they could all have a voice in, or they could participate in. And they did really, I think one of the things that came up in the presentation was that they quite didn't still understand why I would make these choices. For instance, investing the capital for my work into reviving or building these spaces. But they did also appreciate that it somehow changed a lot of things within the city since these institutions have been introduced in the last 2 years. So, which is, for me, it's all that I need.
Yeah. And so we're out of the basement now, and we're now heading up the stairs to the top floor. And this is where, so again, this is the space where you did the talk last week, is that right?
Yes.
Yeah. Fantastic. And so now, what are we looking at now, Ibrahim?
Yeah, so now we are looking at the top floor of the silo. And unlike the other buildings around the country, the chambers were built. So you realize that there are these metals, like these iron rods. Normally they would be the connection.
Yeah.
They'll go all the way up, like 30 meters. And yeah, they will be filled with concrete.
Rebar, aren't they, between?
Yes, yes. So we have like 10 chambers and like 4 negative chambers in between, so 14 chambers in all. And you have these spaces which would be where the grains would go into, and then they would either escape through here, some parts of them.
Yeah.
Yeah, so you have these holes which they would use the machines to pump the grains out and also into it.
Mm.
So I thought it were very interesting because one of my early encounters with this space, it was during the dry season, and it was quite very dry. And when it was raining season, I saw there were a lot of plants and flowers growing in it, and it's just
Yeah.
concrete, but
Yeah.
with a bit of sand over the years, life is striving in it. So I
Yeah.
thought it was interesting. So I was trying to conceive a project with it that I'm still working around.
Fantastic.
Yeah, that was what also led me to thinking that the basement could be promising, because what really happens when we abandon something for so long and people think that, oh, it's dead, but life always finds its way to strive, because humanity always thinks that it's at the center of the universe and
Yes.
life and everything, but life always managed to strive. So that's what I'm trying to do, that if we could turn this top part into some kind of a greenhouse, because the interesting thing about this building is that the kind of foundation that was built back in the 60s, it can as well hold, let's say, a 50-story building in like modern architectural structures. But it doesn't, I don't really want to contribute to putting more weight on it. I rather want to take off the weight and somehow put something as simple as a greenhouse, which is very powerful,
Mm.
something which you can have like special types of plants or flowers
Mm-hmm.
or birds or
Mm.
things like that. Some place where people can actually come within the city and
Mm.
come, not a recreation, but it's also a certain type of reflection, because the easiest thing to do sometimes within like architecture is always to try to prove that, yes, we can dominate spaces, but rather why not just allow the space to live, and then just,
Mm.
do something that we wouldn't think that people don't want anyone would do.
Mm. And so, again, I was just thinking also, seeing you've got various people there working with you, and obviously collaboration is a huge part of your practice, particularly local collaborators. Can you just sort of explain why, how you came about, finding collaborators as well to work with you on these projects?
Okay, let me
And maybe
turn
we
this
can
on.
see your beautiful face again. There we go.
Oh, well, yeah, the idea of working with collaborators has been important, because for me, I think that these collaborators make the work possible.
Mm.
Like the jute sacks, the only reason why I started collecting them was because I felt that the collaborators had produced it. Because when you go to the market and you see how they trade with the bags, the charcoal, and
Mm.
how they stitch them up when they cut the bags open, using pieces of their cloth and all that. I thought that was one of the interesting things. Of course, the physical condition and also material condition within those spaces, and also the conditions that these individuals inhabit, is also something that I try to reflect upon within the work. That's why I thought that in uh, in trying to resolve the in trying to resolve that, that was one of the decisions that I made, to use most of the capital that comes from the work in order to create these spaces that can change the narrative going forward. So in the case of this building, there are these young men who normally sit here just to hang around.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe they smoke once in a while.
Mm-hmm.
But I thought it was quite interesting that when I was interested in acquiring, when the government said they were going to sell the building, they got in touch with me and they said, "Oh, you should try and acquire it, because we think that you can do something very meaningful and useful with it."
Mm-hmm.
And normally, no one would care about it, but sometimes the people that we least expect from,
Mm.
I think that they are the ones who rather uphold the values that we think that we know, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So I when I started acquiring the building, I started working with them to literally excavate the building in the last 3 months. So they have been helping to do everything. And sometimes we bring other people else from elsewhere to help us in this, but they really can't, because they do not feel any sense of, they don't feel as much close to the building as they do, because they've been sitting around the building, for instance, for the last 5 or 10 years.
Mm.
So I thought that was very important to somehow make them proud that the space that they've been inhabiting for the last 10 years, they could contribute actually to the shifting of the
Mm.
space and bringing it back into the public domain.
No, definitely. I'd like to open this up. If I don't know whether anybody has any questions. As I say, please do send them through to the chat box. But yeah, and I think the other thing I just want to just mention while we sort of have this moment is again, we've got the wonderful exhibition on whitecube.com, the online exhibition, which has a series of works of the Jute Sack works, but also, you know, we've got a film in there as well, which kind of gives a kind of indication of some of the kind of toil and labor that's been involved in you know, getting the silo to the stage it's at now as well. So yeah, please do. And I think also we've also got some images, I think, to share as well, because perhaps we can just talk a little bit about some of the other kinds of spaces you've got at both Red Clay and SCCA.
Okay. Yeah. If she shares the images, I can use the images as a starting point. Yeah. So this is very important. This image, it's literally one of the airplanes that we took from I bought and we took from Accra to Tamale, and we've been using it as a classroom for teaching kids. The reason why the silo was important, I was thinking about it almost as some kind of a teleportation device. And I think that the airplane also has that same quality. When I brought the airplanes from Accra, for me, it was important to be able to establish a relationship between the excavating of the silo and also literally filling the airplane with these kits that somehow it shifts the way they think about these technologies, because we've been doing drone classes because I've been using a lot of drone in my work in photographing the buildings. So when Red Clay was built, that was one of the ideas that we're playing around, like how to introduce these technologies to these rural communities or to these kids. So by combining, let's say, the remote control of the drone and then the cockpit. So for instance, we put the remote control in the cockpit. Yeah. So the kids are able to compare, let's say, the joystick to, let's say, what the pilot would use within the cockpit. And also comparing, let's say, the gear of the engine versus how to start the rotors or the propellers on the drone and things like that. So for me, that's one of the ideas that I'm thinking about, how to connect spaces and also how to connect different things, because the airplanes literally are dead and they are not things that can fly anymore. But the fact that they cannot fly physically does not mean that they cannot help another generation to be able to leap in their imagination. Yeah, so this, for instance, is the drawings that the kids would normally do of the instruments of the airplane or the drone, parts of the drone. And then we use those same drawings that they will do and put them in the cockpit and try to let them understand how ordinary it can be. So in a way, we're trying to let them know that we are trying to use their own materials to teach them, so it doesn't seem so removed and so distant. At the end of the day, why can't we inspire children to want to become astronauts or astrophysicists or people who would come to invent things that we are even yet to dream about? So those are some of the things that we are trying to do with these kinds of spaces.
That's fantastic.
Yeah.
We have one question. So the first question is through is what have been the benefits for you of not traveling due to COVID?
All the things that you've seen, all this work that I'm showing now has been all the work that I've been doing in the COVID period. Before, I think it was difficult to hold thoughts and ideas together because the world is too quick and so fast. We're always in a hurry to go from London to Paris or to New York. But suddenly, I'm just in Accra and in Tamale, and I have all the time in the world to follow up with proposals and ideas that I want to work with. And that's all you have to do. And once you stay with something for a long time in the same place, I think the art world sometimes takes things for granted because we get to move around so much that we almost forget what it means like to be like everyone else, just to be in one place and to live in that place and the limitation of that place. And I think the COVID for me was actually a gift because I was able to do enough reflection for more than in the last 8 years of my practice. I think I've done more reflection since March than I have in the entire period of my practice. So it's been quite good.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting, as you say, that given that you know, everything that you've been doing is about trying to also bring this back to Tamale, back to
Yes.
back to where, you know, and so this enforced kind of grounding has been good. We've got a question also from Claudia, who wanted to know what was excavated from the building when you excavated?
It was dirt, it was clay, and also sand, gravel, because in the 70s and 80s, unfortunately, there were a few people who drowned in the building, and the city thought the best way to cover it up was to pour sand into the building to cover the hole. So all this area you see with the green grass is actually filled with like clay that was excavated from the building. So it was more than 60 tons of like sand and clay. And hopefully the idea is to be able to use it because it's a lot of soil and manure. So we will be able to use it for our greenhouse projects in the future when we get to it.
And so you're saying you're going to grow, I mean, are you going to grow any particular?
We're going to grow all kinds of things. Yeah.
Right.
As you can see, there's an urban farm just ahead. So
which farm is it?
There's a farm. They grow vegetables, mushrooms, mushrooms, cabbage, okra, tomatoes, and other things. Yeah. And it's also possible because of the architecture of the building, because there's a lot of water stored in the reservoir. So it's very easy for them to access water, because in the dry season, it can be very dry in the region. But because of the proximity of the water to the land, the farmer can be able to grow food throughout the year. And that is one thing that I think is promising. Yes.
Yeah, no, really good. Next question is from Georgie, and so you spoke about sort of ghosts with the building, and does that link with your Parliament of Ghosts project in Manchester, which the wonderful project that you did as part of the Manchester International Festival?
Yes, I think so. I've always been interested in ghosts, either in objects through the sacks or through the boxes, or through the sewing machines, or like the buildings I've worked or wrapped around, the histories that have been contained within them. But the Parliament of Ghosts was particularly special because I was doing my research around the Ghana railways and the history of it, and collecting objects from there to build this literal parliament, both in Manchester and later on in Tamale as part of Red Clay. So I thought a silo was quite interesting because in the Parliament of Ghosts, I think there's one interesting thing here. Yeah. So I was comparing these spaces to the Parliament of Ghosts, because you can literally sit in these spaces. And I thought that was the beautiful thing about it, because when we had the conversation or the talk last week, there were a lot of people that actually sat in these spaces in order to, don't mind the screen got damaged.
Oh, I was wondering is that another covering of the building?
No. There was a storm, and when we put the screen up, we didn't install it. We just used it temporarily for the talk, and then there was a storm that destroyed it, so we have to redo it. So literally they could sit here and just watch the screen, which was quite large. So I thought it was actually very interesting to be able to create a relationship between the Parliament of Ghosts, which was something that I created as an artist, and a building like this, which was created to contain food, but has these pockets of spaces which allows us to be able to interact with it, almost like the Parliament of Ghosts. And also literally, this one has this one is really like a Parliament of Ghosts, because it has other life forms in it, like the bats, the snails, the fishes, the snakes, which the Parliament of Ghosts didn't have, because the Parliament of Ghosts was more anthropomorphic in a sense.
But it's all about assembly as well, isn't it? As a gathering of people, which is also
exactly
what I think we're all craving at this moment. Is that So we've got another question where, you know, you've done so many wonderful large scale projects around the world, but which one of those do you think is closest to your heart, or do you feel most proud of?
It's a difficult question. I don't want to get into trouble, but no, but I think that I will always go maybe for the closest project, because currently we have the installation in between the world and dreams at the University of Michigan at the Center of Humanities, and then also at the University Museum. And I think for me currently it's important because yeah, it's very difficult actually to create anything within this period. And the curators, Amanda, she's been the curator. She's been working very, very hard to make this work amidst everything that is happening, particularly in America now with all that is happening, all the chaos. So I really appreciate every effort that has gone into it, because normally I would travel there, or my assistant Francis or Benjamin would go, and then they would go and do some really amazing work. But suddenly I have to rely on Zoom or on WhatsApp to be able to get some of these things done. But they still managed to get the work done really beautifully. So I think that currently is my most exciting.
Is it the first one that you've ever done where you haven't actually been to the site, that you actually haven't been in attendance?
Exactly.
Amazing. Wow.
Exactly. Yeah.
Hence the wide smile in that account. You didn't need to get on a plane again. We've got another question from Alex, who'd like to know about the use of the sort of brightly coloured striped smock fabrics that you've used in a number of works. You've made some paintings, you call them, but alongside the Jute Sets. So I think these are really, this is referring to the works that were shown in Manchester last year, and how, where are they from, and what's the significance of these?
Yeah, the interesting thing about these works are that I started producing them in 2012. Yeah, even before I started making the jute sack pieces or the installations. But I was doing them during my MFA, and I never really showed them or had a chance to show them until last year, properly for the first time, as part of the Parliament of Ghosts at the MIF. And one of the things I used to do originally was to exchange fabric with the market women. So the wax prints, I would buy new ones, and then I would take the old ones, just as I did with the jute sacks, and I would wrap them around these panels to create these paintings. And it was also inspired by Yinka Shonibare's work and his use of fabric and all that. But I was mostly just interested in the relationship between the fabric and the wood and the kind of composition that I was doing. So it was purely aesthetical. There was nothing really political about it. But the jute sack was able to extend the work and to be able to make it a lot more political because of the aesthetics, the introduction of that particular aesthetics that it brought to it. Because unlike this material, which is colorful, when you see it, it's somehow beautiful, and you can have, let's say, personal relations with it because you have a material that looks like it. But a jute sack is just rugged, and mostly it's just something that you think that you don't really want. So it's quite repulsive within the local context when you see it lying down in the floor in the market or all that. So I wanted somehow to be able to use that aesthetics to start the conversation I wanted to happen around my practice. So those are the differences.
But I think obviously, with the jute sacks as well, what's extraordinary is that then you have these sort of moments of detail where you have the kind of, the coffee tags, the official tags that then was sort of certification for the cocoa beans. But it's I suppose what's beautiful in one context is then ugly in another, as you say. I mean, it's like, and with the with the jute sack works, I mean, what's interesting when you look at them as well is that then some of them have writing on them. What does that refer to when you've got this lettering on it that's been sort of graffitied on?
Well, I think I was interested in them originally because of the tattoos that were on the arms of my collaborators, like people traveling from north to south or from east to west, people traditionally writing, let's say, some kind of biodata on their body in case they die or they're lost in some kind of transit. And that would be used as some kind of identification. And sometimes some of these marks would be transferred or written onto bags or objects that they own. And I always thought that there was some kind of a direct relationship between the body and these materials, the jute sacks, in a sense that when you think about the jute sacks in terms of the aesthetics and what it is now, we don't really think about it in relation to the condition of the body and the failures of, let's say, the post-independence period. So I was mostly using that as a starting point to be able to select the specific materials that I was using for my work. Yeah, so I have tried to let that somehow reflect in the choices that I make with regards to sites I work with, buildings I work with, collaborators, how to negotiate with people, and also the kind of aesthetics that are created out of, let's say, projects that we do, and yeah, going forward, blah, blah, blah.
And so we've got a question here from Alex. And you work across 3 cities, Tamale, Accra, Sekondi. And how do each of the characters of these cities alter or affect your work? Do they?
Yeah, my entire practice started from Kumasi, honestly. Without Kumasi, I wouldn't have had my practice as an artist. From
and you feel
Kumasi,
that's really through caricature as well, being such a kind of important.
Yeah, caricature and then the Black Star Lines. Collective.
Can you just explain what the Black Star Lines is for the viewers?
Yeah, so the Black Star Lines is it's a collective made up of artists, teachers, professors, various people who've traveled across, who've come to Ghana to like do projects with us and all that. But mostly it started off as a caricature, encouraging like students to collaborate with one another and to be able to like put their resources together to be able to either create spaces or create their own exhibitions. So the collective was somehow created to help with artists to be able to realize one, exhibitions that they wanted to do, and secondly also just to be able to at least guide maybe other artists, and thirdly also to be able to bring our forces together, one intellectually, and secondly also maybe material sense to be able to realize some things. Caricature, of course, is we call him the Godfather. He's the one who somehow led this initiative from the very beginning because of what he did within the curriculum at KNUST when we in the late 90s when he became a professor there. SCCA and Red Clay, and then everything that we're doing, we think that they are somehow babies of Black Star Lines because there are many other artists, Kwesi Ohiniaye or Bernard Quay Jackson or Robin Riskin or Hassan or Francis or Teresa or Tracy Thompson. We are all trying as much as possible just to find ways in which we can somehow contribute to what art already is, and to be able to shift forms within it. Because in the previous generation, art used to be something which was fixed, and then you would use it as a means to be able to produce art. But Black Star Lines is trying to somehow encourage students or artists to be able to always push the boundaries of art. Art is not what we know it to be. Art, we always believe that art is yet to manifest itself. So by building SCCA, we think that, oh no, something else can be done. Then Red Clay comes along, extending the narrative of what the artwork or the artist can do. Then the Nkrumah Voli comes along. So the idea is that art, we always have to find a certain sense of renewal within art. So in summary, Black Star Lines represents that idea of not staying comfortable and feeling that art can always evolve and be more than what it is.
So you know, another question here is about some of your earlier interventions were in marketplaces, and so again, you know, what was the significance of that site for the location of the work, because it's not a kind of conventional kind of space for these kind of interventions?
Yeah, but it's important because the market women or the children in the market will get to see contemporary art and also get to see it from a different position or perspective. And also, I'm not just thinking about it in relation to the human experience. I was also just interested in the relationship between forms, because by going to the railways and covering objects there, or certain machine parts or part of the architecture or covering bridges. Even some parts of the bridges, no one is going to see it except maybe the artist covering it or the relationship between that part of the bridge and then let's say uh, the drain or the plant or bacteria forms and other things which are there. So I think for me it's just about experience, creating experiences within spaces which ordinarily you wouldn't find if let's say you went to a typical gallery space, let's say on the continent, or in, I'm just reducing it just to Ghana, to with regards to some of the galleries that we had originally for many decades that were showing artists' works. The idea was to expand the context because a lot of these market women were heavily represented in paintings. If you go to most of the art, the spaces, the gallery spaces, you'd always see the market woman, the village girl carrying flower, the water pot, water from the river, blah blah blah. But we never really create works that somehow goes back to really affect or touch the conditions of these spaces. As in the work that I'm doing, like physically creating infrastructure or spaces, how much more even create installations that end up in those spaces that those people can have interactions or conversations. It doesn't have to be art at the end of the day. But I think that for me, the idea of the event, what happens when the artist goes outside the boundaries or the context of what he knows as art in order to create new forms, that is where actually we can expect some revolutionary things to happen within. So definitely. I somehow,
yeah, definitely. We've got a question here from Layla. I understand that when you were a undergrad, you were influenced by Robert Rauschenberg. Can you talk to us about that? And are there any particular artists or artworks that hold an importance for you, that speak to you or inspire you now?
Yeah, I think Robert Rauschenberg, it was in third year when we were looking at like minimalism, pop art, and other things. And one of the works that came up a lot was Monogram, the goat with the tire stuck in the middle. And I always thought that was really quite interesting because I was at the time we were trying to I think one of caricature's class, experimental drawing, and also one of these classes where we were trying to experiment with different forms, trying to understand art history and how to apply that in the works that we're making as artists. And I somehow thought it was very interesting because Robert Rauschenberg's paintings were quite beautiful, but at the same time, they used materials that you could find ordinarily. I thought it was sophisticated, but yet very simple in their approach. So I was casting bodies and objects at a time, and I thought I could somehow use some of the techniques that he was using within a modern art period in order to be able to create these works. But as I started working more and more into my MFA, I realized that art was a lot more political than it seemed or was presented within a modernist context. And hence, I wanted to somehow expand the context of the objecthood and the site to begin with. I wanted to somehow implicate the site within the work, within the object itself. So that's how come I started doing the occupation series. Because by, let's say, creating a work and then allowing the work just to occupy a traditional art institution, I didn't think that it did much to the extension of the conversation. So artists like Christo played a very important role in understanding and trying to know that it was possible to do these ambitious projects. Of course, coming from the 70s, we could also look at artists like Robert Smithson. We could look at artists like Anna Mendieta. In 2013, when I did a residency at Gasworks, there was a major retrospective of Anna Mendieta at the Hayward Gallery, which I went to see. And it was really phenomenal because I wasn't so familiar with Anna Mendieta's work. But so that was very inspiring to think that an artist had been able to do this body of work, and also looking at the context and the form and also how political her work seemed to be. It also gave me that sense of courage to be able to at least push the boundaries. And of course, if I'm looking at within my own country, then aside, let's say, the work of someone like caricature as an artist and as a teacher who has used pedagogical form to somehow inspire his students to be able to think about art differently. Someone like Ella Natri has been very, very important in somehow just believing that it is possible, because sometimes as an artist, you're working within a context, but because you haven't really So for instance, when I was a student, we used to learn about the Venice Biennale or learn about White Cube, Anthony Gormley, Doris Salcedo. I remember last time I came to London, we had dinner with Mona Hatoum, and it felt so surreal. I was like, oh, it felt like a dream. I was like, oh man, am I having a dream? Something like that. Well, I remember the first time I had a conversation with you. But you know, as an artist, because every artist is trying to produce the best work that they think that they can, and they want to work in the most relevant exhibitions or work with the most relevant artists or have conversations with artists either in the present or artists who've done works in the past that somehow their work becomes an extension of. So for me, it has been very, 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 very important to at least to be able to make a contribution within this line.
We've got time just for a couple more questions. Get them in quick if you've got a chance. But I've just one here from Penny. Is the future of the building more interesting than the past? Which is a great question.
Yeah,
and how does that historical narrative of the landscape and the land and its use affect its future? So is the future more important, do you think?
Yeah, I'm very much interested in the future, but I also don't want to discard the past. I want the past to be a guiding or reference point in order for the future which is yet to come. So we shouldn't take things for granted, because we live in a generation where everything is happening so quickly with technology. There are a lot of people living now who don't really even understand what it means, what a Walkman is, or even what a telephone in a traditional sense is, even if it's something as simple as that. Because now we have like social media, so everything, and also now in the age of like the 21st century with high consumerism, like we're producing and producing and producing and producing. So for me, the idea that we have spaces like this which already exist is important to me. Of course, I've used some of these spaces to be able to propose new spaces like CCA and Red Clay, which are doing different things, retrospectives, which are doing like workshops with drones, with kids, which are doing like, which are storing archives. We have library spaces. We have exhibition spaces, residencies, things that we're working on. But at the same time, knowing that a building like this exists and we can somehow time travel and go back into it and be able to use it to almost prophesize the future in a very different way. I think it's very beautiful. And that's why I was making a relationship between the void in the building and the teaching of the kids in the airplane. Because I think that there is, although they come from very different timelines, like this coming from the 60s and the plane, let's say, coming from the 80s, and then now being able to combine these two ideas now to be able to teach a generation to expand the way they think about the world and the future which is yet to come and how we can inhabit it. I think it's very important. So for me, both the building's past and the future that it proposes, I want to put them on the same playing field. I want to put them on the same playing field.
No, it's fantastic. And then we've got time for one more question, which is, can you just tell us about future projects? I think there's a few future projects that you can't tell us about for
spoiler alert.
Very exciting reasons. But maybe you just want to say a little bit about what you're planning for the exhibition at White Cube coming up in January.
I think I don't know if there's a title which has been gotten for that yet, but it's basically the idea of that exhibition was to use the ideas from the Parliament of Ghosts as a point of departure in some of the collages that I'm currently working on between these different spaces, and also the Capital Corpses, which is this project which I've been working on the past couple of years, collecting like machine parts, sewing machines and other things, and also textbooks and other relevant materials from public schools around. Of course, I've always been interested in connecting spaces which children inhabit and also using that to be able to create like pieces in a contemporary sense. So I think the exhibition will try as much as possible to somehow be able to articulate some of the forms that I'm trying to somehow deal with at this very stage of my practice. Yeah, so yeah, I think I want to leave it open because maybe there are some works that have never been shown before. Most of the works which will be shown in the exhibition are new works which I've been working on the past couple of years.
Mm-hmm.
So it will also be, there should be an element of surprise in it, like drawings, because a lot of people always ask me, but Ibrahim, you say you studied painting, but we never see any painting of yours. And I feel very offended when people say that. I'm like, can't you see the jute sack is a painting?
Exactly.
So I think that in introducing things like drawings, literally in the form of collages and other things within this exhibition, it will also add a different context to the practice. So I'm very excited about what it brings.
So let's watch this space, in short. Ibrahim, I'd just like to wrap up. I would like to thank everybody for joining us for this very special tour, and it's been great, sort of great engaging questions as well. I'd really like to thank my colleagues Georgie Wimbush and Circa Richardson. Circa's brilliantly curated Ibrahim's online exhibition, and to Cecily Bates, who produced this online event. But most of all, Ibrahim, thank you so much for sharing the tour of the studio or the new space with us, and offering such a wonderful, engaging tour. It's been such a pleasure, and also such a pleasure to see blue sky. It's raining here in London, so very envious. But thank you again, and thank you all, and yeah, have a great weekend.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.